Oh man, Sir Pell, how are you doing?
Hi, Mike. I've got a bit of a sore throat, but I can hear you loud and clear.
Oh, good. It must be some ungodly middle of the night where you are.
It's just after sunset.
Oh, well, that's not so bad. Oh, good. Well, I assume that people will be joining us. Uh, see if I start. Oh, hold on just a second. Oh, people are not, didn't get this thing. All right. You just stay, so to speak, you stay here. I have to go worry about getting some other people in. Encourage
Okay.
anybody who turns up. I'll just leave it on.
Okay.
All righty. And I'll be try to be quiet here in the background while I rescue things for people. Apparently, some people did not get on the list, which is not a good thing. All right. Oh, uh, nuts.
Morning.
Morning. If it is morning where you are, it's
Morning.
it's
Right,
evening.
true.
It's evening
Yep,
where it's
sorry.
evening where Robert is. Uh,
Hello. I should know better by now.
well, it's always a question of when you join in. I've a couple of people I apparently didn't have on the list. So, but I see Renee is here, so she's on the list for sure. I'm not, but I just have to be. Let me check. I'm gonna, Robert, why don't you host things for a bit and tell people about how things look from your part of the world just for a moment while I check to see if there's anybody in distress here.
I'm not very well situated for hosting because I've got a
Oh, all
touch
right.
of
Hey,
laryngitis.
Jill, why don't you do it? You're host for the moment.
Um, this is great. I'm the newest person in the group.
There you go. Oh, no, you're not.
With
No, you're not.
uh,
No, you're not.
I'm an
Actually.
old, returning uh, person
Yeah.
joining in from Chicago. Um, I'd love to know where each of you are joining in. Mara, are you California?
Yep, my sunroom here, TV room in Berkeley, California.
Oh,
And
great.
Jill is very interested in early childhood development and the organization of early childhood education. And Mara, what do you do?
I am fortunate enough to be the executive director for international network of programs called University Community Links. So UC Links was the system version of the fifth dimension spread across the University of California systems and far beyond around the world.
There you
So
go.
that's what I get.
I can't see people,
Um,
so somebody else there.
yes, we have Amanda. Um, Mara, I just want to say I was part of the building of the fifth dimension here in Chicago way back. Uh,
Oh, awesome. I love
so
that.
if the wizard can be found, we need the wizard right now. So we'll work
Yes.
on invoking that spirit.
Right?
Um,
Exactly.
Renee, can you give us a little background on you?
Sure. So I'm currently working at UC Berkeley at the Data Lab. And my work has been in thinking about communication supports and access for young people who are labeled non-speaking. So kind of disability studies and education, thinking about access to communication. How are we supporting folks? How do we leverage what families are doing? Things like that.
Cool.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here today, and I'm in Pacifica right now. That's where my home is.
Wow. And Amanda?
Hi, everyone. I am a first-year PhD student at UCLA. And Mara, I think I'm going to be meeting you also on the 1st of November in the coffee hour with Marjorie and Inma. So
excellent.
I'm working on a project with them, starting an after-school program in a local neighborhood in Los Angeles. And we're working on storytelling as a way to improve biliteracy and a sense of community for elementary students.
Fabulous. And Robert, can you tell us, I'd love to know where you are.
I'm in Lusaka, Zambia, Central Africa, which is where most of my life has been led. I'm not sure if I'm actually audible. I've got a bit of a sore throat, but I have worked with Mike over the years, had a pleasure of being a visiting scholar at Rockefeller before he moved to the West Coast, and then spent time with him in his San Diego lab. So we've corresponded a lot over the years, and I have great admiration for the fifth dimension. I'm more or less retired, but I still do some research and graduate supervision and mentoring, mainly on issues of indigenous psychology in Africa. So I was struck by the resonance of this paper with some of the concerns of the new generation of African developmental scholars who are beginning to try to bring in the cultures of their participant populations into the design of their research on early childhood. I better stop there. I'm running out of voice.
Well, I just want to say we must have met in that other world, because I met Mike when he was at Rockefeller and worked with him there in New York. So maybe we actually hung out a little bit.
As
that would have been.
I certainly read some of your work and cited.
I'm sure none of us have changed since you were at Rockefeller, right, Mike? I mean, we don't look any.
Absolutely. No, I'm a spitting image of what I was then. Anybody would recognize me. What's very interesting here is we have a great group, but we don't have our authors.
Mm-hmm.
And our authors have helped some of us here get here. So I don't understand where the authors are. And I don't have Andrew's phone number. So we could talk behind his back or something. I'm not quite sure. Not quite sure how best to proceed here. Macy is here. Oh yeah. No, Auntie, you also. Everybody should. We have time here. Let's figure out who we are, because we want to take something out of this. Robert has actually. Well, let's see. Yeah, Robert, why don't you wrote out? You wrote. I haven't had time because time is crazy. People reading at the last minute, just getting the paper and so on. So that's a. So we want to try to figure out what are the shared history here that people have, so people can take the most out of it, right? Robert, you wrote very quickly a point about there are a couple of points in yours that I thought were important. Before we get to that, Auntie, why don't you introduce yourself? Macy, you should introduce yourself, and then maybe the speakers will be here and we'll reorganize. Okay. So maybe Macy, if I can call on you just to say what you're engaged in, where you're coming from.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Hi everyone, I'm Macy Chesala. It's what we say at home. How are you doing? Have you eaten yet? And I'm currently in Lawrence, Kansas, but I grew up across Singapore and northern Thailand. and am currently an assistant professor at the University of Minnesota, really thinking about stories and Indigenous theories of learning and well-being and how we might redesign our schools based on those stories of what the good life or healthy living and learning kind of look like. So excited to also felt a lot of resonance with the paper and thinking about as Auntie was mentioning, utopia, social dreaming, and ecological validity.
Mm-hmm. Your issues, because a lot of Macy's work takes place not in a classroom, but out taking a walk with a bunch of people. Just different form of activity. Auntie?
There is a bit of background noise. Is it so disturbing? I wrote my introduction to the chat.
No,
but
it's not too disturbing. If you keep your face right there near the, if you stay near the microphone, I'm hearing you clearly enough.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. So my name is Antti Rajala. I'm currently in New York for a couple of months, but I work for University of Eastern Finland in Finland, and also University of Helsinki. And I have been working with cultural historical activity theory and sometimes sociocultural perspectives more broadly. I'm interested in school pedagogy, and yeah, I have written a lot about agency. Maybe currently my research could be described in terms of the umbrella term global education. So my current main project is about climate change education and supporting climate activism. And I use the notion of utopia and utopian pedagogy and utopian methodology in that respect. With Mike, we are publishing on the topic, but I'm interested in other aspects of global education, such as peace education and like global awareness, decoloniality, and such topic. It's great to be here, and I enjoyed reading the paper for today. Nice to meet you all.
Okay. I'm a little puzzled. I'm going to check my email again here just right now. Hold on. He doesn't have the Zoom link that I've just been sending out to everybody. Oh, he's outside of that. Hold on, everybody. Hold on just a second. Okay. All right. Okay.
Even as I was signing on today, had to re-sign in, reset password. It kind of sent me chasing.
I also had difficulty because I have to do, but let me just do what I'm doing here now.
Yep.
Okay.
I love the theme that seems to be coming through the description of the work we've each been pursuing, where it is among people taking a walk. Storytelling is not context dependent, but obviously the context where it does happen, those are the ones we want to figure out what's working and how to help it have legs.
Yeah. Okay.
That's where I spent my time with 3, 4, and 5-year-olds with storytelling, and I think it's just one of the most exciting ways to get up close to thinking in the making.
Yeah, absolutely true. Okay, I think Andrew should probably be there he is. He's connecting to audio. We are holding our breath, and you're connected, Andrew. You're muted. You're connected, Andrew. You're muted. Aha, there
Hello?
he is.
Hi, everybody. You can hear me okay now?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about the mix-up.
It's all right. It's mine. No, it's me. I thought nobody should put me in charge of what it is that the technical side of this. and I have no assistant. So, and there are a number of lists are passing in front of me daily, so it gets a little confusing. My apologies.
Yeah.
By way of compensation, all of us have gotten to know each other, and so where we kind of ended up was with, and we're quite diverse here. We have Robert Serpell, who has done a lot of work in Africa and in Zambia on culture development and education, and been involved all over the place in higher education. Mara Mahmoud is the director of UC Links, which is a big statewide program that does the kind of after school courses that we do as practicum courses in the University of California. Jill McNamee is professor emeritus from Erickson Institute of Early Childhood Education. Renee, I forgot what you said. I'm sorry. Was it passed by? I thought, oh, that was so cool what she said. Oh, she's a data. She does. You do data, right?
So I'm at the D Lab. It's called the Data Lab at UC Berkeley. My work is sort of
Right.
at the intersections of disability studies and education.
There you go. And Amanda?
I'm a first year PhD student,
Right.
so I'm
Right.
still sort of getting my feet wet, but I'm
Right.
working
And
on a UC Links
right.
project.
Right. And she's at UCLA, is that correct? It's a good place to be from. I got my PhD at my MA, my BA at UCLA. Macy is, I would say, Macy was started out in Singapore, ended up in Thailand, and it represents sort of for me, the group of scholars worried about indigenous alternatives to the structure of formal education on their land. And there's a large group of that, and she's one of the active researchers in that group. And Auntie Raila is an early childhood specialist who has moved into environmental education, environmental justice in early childhood education in Finland. So there's a nice group for us to talk about.
Yeah, that's great. So just a little bit of an introduction for me to kind of catch up to your conversation. So I did my PhD at UC Santa Cruz, so sharing some kind of California affiliations with some of you. And my focus was the cultural patterns of learning and development among Indigenous and Indigenous heritage families, communities, and kids. And my commitment in that work, go bananas. So my commitment in that work was trying to counter the not only overrepresentation, but the really hegemonic dominance of middle class cultural patterns of learning and development for what we think and what we thought we knew about developmental psychology. And my focus was children's initiative, skills and collaboration, and pro-social helping. So in the paper you probably saw, you probably noted some of those currents, and just where I draw my attention in terms of critiques and things like that. But in the broader context of my work is cultural psychology. So trying to understand psychological phenomena in a broader context, not just sort of in between the ears and behind the eyes of people. But understanding psychological phenomena as emergent in the relationship between individuals and cultural processes. So my sense is that I'm sort of, that's a lot of folks here are pretty sympathetic to some of those views. But so Mike had the really good idea of starting out the conversation with just sort of a shared point of reference around, what would it look like for a curriculum or a program that took up some of these ideas that we tried to promote in the chapter. So I have a couple of videos that I thought we might start with. You might be familiar with these. So overall, it's about 10 minutes between the two videos, but this is work by Shireen Basagi and Meg Ascudé doing tinkering work, so sort of STEM tinkering work, but taking a pretty different approach in terms of the assumptions and practices around learning and development. So I think this will give us kind of maybe more practical grounding for some of the theoretical concerns, and also might be a basis for just defining concepts around ecological validity and what does this whole strengths-based thing really mean. So let me try to share my screen. Oh, who's ever the host, I think you need to give me permission.
Thank you. I'm the host, but I need to be reminded to do anything. So
no, that's right.
Let's see, I have to do more, and I have to. All right, somebody's gonna have to tell me how I turn that over. Share screen. Sorry. Oh, I don't want to share screen. I want to turn it over to you.
Maybe to make Andrew a co-host under the participants list.
Let's do
Could
that.
work.
Thank you, Macy. Let me just close that. Andrew. All right, okay. That opens up. Make co-host. Thank you. Andrew, I think you're good.
Yeah, that just showed up on my end. So I think I think you're right. Okay, so I'm going to share sound and portion of the screen. Okay, I'm gonna reduce this here a little bit. Okay, I'm just going to play the first part and just check in with you to make sure that the sound works.
Circles where we start with a circle.
Can you hear that? Did you hear that bit? Okay, great. Let me just rewind here.
Maybe a couple of the educators who work with us who come with me in the van to the program. And there's some great conversations that happen at that time. Preparation for the things that we're thinking about and the hopes that we have for that activity, and maybe some particular kids that we want to think about working with that day. And then when we get to the clubhouse, we meet our staff, our teen staff, who are usually coming straight from school. And we get a chance to chat with them about the plans and maybe strategize together a little bit about facilitation. And then we get maybe about half an hour to set up the room before the kids get there. And that's fun because we get to set up the room differently depending on what we're doing that day. So we have sort of short terms for configurations of tables that we've developed over time. And then after that, the kids will come in and everyone pretty much knows to sit down in a circle, because we always start with a circle.
Why is it working?
Why is it working?
Why isn't it?
It was working, it was just going really, really slow.
When I'm planning new activities for the kids, there's several things I keep in mind as I develop them. They should be fun, first of all, and they should include a lot of exploration and lots of different possible pathways. If there's multiple solutions to something, then that's a good indication. Another thing I look for is interaction with real materials and real tools. Kids can tell pretty easily when you're bringing some kid stuff, and I think they really step up when you bring them real materials and real tools.
It's about creating a playful space that's open-ended, that asks new questions of you every time you sort of engage with the materials, that allows you to improvise as you're moving through the activity, to be able to back up when you get into the process, learn a few things, and then the thing that you've worked on isn't necessarily too precious, so you can step back and start again, and that really reinforces the iterative aspects of this kind of work.
Originally I was really excited about the activities, but then after I started going and participating more and seeing the kids really delve into the material, I noticed that it was not so much, or not only about the activities, but that they were getting a lot more from it. So at Boys and Girls Club, our first core value is putting youth first in all of our decisions, and I think that carries over with tinkering in a lot of ways. I just personally value the fact that they get to feel safe, and their enthusiasm around learning really means a lot to me personally.
I think the fundamental difference between tinkering and other programs is the facilitation. It's the fact that facilitation is so important, and developing the facilitator skills is very important to tinkering.
I always have to remind myself to take the time to understand what the students are working on and what they're thinking about. And there are a lot of assumptions that I might have, especially if things are really high-paced or I'm feeling stressed about supporting all the kids in the room. It's important for me to remind myself to slow down when I approach someone who's working and really try to understand what their goals are and what their questions are and what they're thinking about, because it's usually something different than what I might have assumed if I just looked at what they were doing.
I see what you're doing.
Oftentimes the kid will have a path that is very clear to them and may take you out of your particular comfort zone with respect to this activity, and it might come right back in and fold in a way that's surprising to you and make you, and basically expand your sense of what you're doing. So I think as a facilitator it's good to have a little bit of respect for their contributions and a little bit of create some breathing room for the experience to be what it is for that individual. I think it's particularly important to have experience with the activity that you're doing so you can recognize when those things might be diversions that might not come back.
I love to see the kids using power tools and drills and saws, sewing machines, the metal working equipment. I think it makes them feel validated and trusted that they're capable of using those things.
And some of the things that we've noticed have to do with just their roles in the setting and how those have shifted as one way of thinking about learning. So kids that might have been terrified of the hot glue gun early on when they were 6 years old are now one of the resident experts on hot glue guns in the setting that other younger kids now look to for support. Or in circle time, sometimes the people that assist Meg in leading circle are the older, more veteran kids. So that shift in roles has been really neat to see.
I think sometimes new kids feel as though if they don't leave with an object or artifact, then something is wrong, and so they try to finish by the time they leave, or they have a particular attachment. And I think that's just it's a little cultural shift that happens within the space over time, to realizing that just coming in and engaging with the materials and learning particular skills is really important. And for me, I think when I think about my own practice, it's reflected in this notion that the object isn't necessarily the precious thing, because I know if I've done it, that I'm walking out with that capacity, with that capability.
A lot of people talk about tinkering and making as being strong in supporting kids celebrating failure, and I take issue with that word, because I think if we think about real scientific practices, there are no such thing as failures. Anything that doesn't work out still teaches you something, and I think it's been really important for us to think about supporting the ideas of iteration and drafts in the way that we teach, that it isn't something that we should expect would just come naturally to kids, considering the way that they're taught to learn in other settings. So just the language of supporting drafts and supporting trying something out and observing and trying something else out is something that we're constantly working into the way that we talk about activities.
So there's just one more video. This one's about half as long, so just a little bit more, and they take some different angles on this same program.
And one of the more broad ways that I think we think about it. Since 2012, this Exploratorium has partnered with the San Francisco Boys and Girls Clubs to imagine and document and design a weekly after-school tinkering program. We've come away with an approach to equitable science learning that starts with access to quality science education, but really flourishes and takes on new life when special attention is given to the how of teaching and learning. It's been really important to me and to Shireen when we started working on this project to consider issues of equity and inclusion in the program. And one of the more broad ways that I think we think about it is realizing how often kids of color in low-income areas are identified as having behavior problems, or that their ways of approaching learning isn't seen as valid. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity in a workshop learning environment where kids can approach the work with different energy levels and different ways of expressing and talking. And I think that can be really important for them to see their own ways of being as also intelligent ways of being.
A lot of times, and I think especially in the last decade, with regards to the emphasis on testing and school-based kind of learning, there can often be a definition of learning as a cognitive process or as a purely mental process, and on kids learning particular academic skills in that way. And I think what's exciting is to think about all the other dimensions of learning, learning as an emotional process, as a social process, as a cultural process, historical and political process. And I think when we start to think about learning that way in an after-school setting, we start to see a lot of other possibilities, and we also start to recognize some of the ways kids are engaging intellectually within their social relationships, within their play, and those things I think can be leveraged to continue to deepen their learning.
I appreciate the time that they take to allow each child to talk, and it's also a time where they share from their personal lives how things that they do at home is related to the activity, and so I think that gives a lot of relevance to it, and it makes them feel like science or math or whatever it is that we're doing that day isn't something separate. It's something that they do at home. It's something in their lives, and it's a part of their world too.
One of the common misconceptions that I think can sometimes happen in a tinkering or making space is that oftentimes in traditional ways of thinking about education, we think of the adults as being active or the teacher as being active and the kids as being passive. And then in a more student-centered space, we might be inclined to think of the students as active and the teachers as passive. But we really try to kind of push back on that and move from the idea that all participants in the setting, adults and teens and kids in our case, are active. And what does that mean in terms of facilitating and really engaging in shared activity with the kids and shared explorations? And that connects with the notion that social relationships are really important, that the process of making artifacts is also the process of making relationships, and that those are equally important learning spaces, both intellectually and socially.
What equity means to me in these sorts of practices is really, I think it comes down to respect. Recognizing somebody's intelligence in a way that, or trusting somebody with a particular tool in a way that they might not have been trusted with before. I think those little moments, those little affirmations of their capability are really important. I know they were to me growing up.
Okay. So let me just say maybe just a couple of words about how I see this as an example that brings out some of the arguments that we were trying to make in the paper, and also maybe helps to clarify some of the key concepts, which are sort of the strengths-based approach, and then ecological validity just in general. So in the paper, we talk about a strengths-based approach as being fundamentally an approach that's contextualized and politicized. And so contextualized, we argue, has 3 dimensions. And I think each of those dimensions is really, well, at least to me, I've seen this video a number of times. This obviously, for some of you may be the first time, but in the paper, we argue that a contextualized approach expands the unit of analysis for what's going on in learning development and what's going on psychologically. Views learning, views a number of different constructs that we might be interested in as mutually constituted in individual and kind of contextual processes, right? The next is that it's an appreciation that not only research moments and research contexts, but programs like this are context creating. And so it's the creation of those new, call them research contexts, that creates potential problems that this notion of ecological validity, I think, tries to home in on. And so mismatches between created research contexts or created program contexts and the context of people's everyday lives, and I know that includes multiple contexts, it is sort of the whole ball of wax when we're talking about ecological validity. And so improved ecological validity is looking for improved correspondence or closer correspondence between those contexts, right? Because we all, in a lot of psychological research, cultural research, we have, I'm thinking here of Auden Dahl's notion of ecological commitments, right? We're of course not just theorizing these research moments, we're theorizing people's often capacities more generally. So that correspondence between these contexts is crucial. And then next is a focus on actor perspectives. In this case, the perspectives of kids, and what really understanding what they're trying to do in these moments, what they're trying to do and accomplish, and the perspectives that they have with respect to what's important, what's valued, and where they're going in sort of a future-oriented sense. So I think this program, really emphasizes each one in addition to a number of other things, really emphasizes those three, and those are three that we were really trying to push forward in the paper. So maybe I'll stop here, and I'd love to hear what people think, or wherever we want to take the conversation.
Let's see here. I think a productive way to go might be, Robert, I'm certain that Andrew has not had time to read that note that you sent back. Maybe you even just sent it to me. But I thought that this is focused on ecological validity, Andrew.
Okay.
I'm not certain that it's interesting. Your examples sort of surprised me. Let me put it that way. Let me start, Robert, and then we can, because I want to get in at where ecological validity fits into this, and the idea of ecological validity that you want the context in school to be just like a context somewhere else, I think, or something like that. And I don't think that's what schooling is about. Right. So, you schooling is an institution which people put a lot of labor into creating the resources for the preparation of their kids to take over. Basically, that's what they have. That's the basic thing that they've got to do to keep on keeping on. And so it's separated in modern society a lot. And I'm thinking of your example is super high tech for one thing. So then it's not going to be ecologically valid for the Hmong people in Laos or Vietnam. Not good. So I think this relationship is extremely important, but I don't think that Shirin is trying to get something that is ecologically valid. That's not what she's that's not what she's looking for. Actually, I think it's more like the stuff we do with the fifth dimension. She's trying to look for a form, a life world, a form of activity that people can engage in that will release certain theoretically present potentials in people's development that we highly value. And this question of values and what we do, Robert raises in I think, some important ways. So this is not to say anything wrong about the research. That's all very extraordinary. It's all great, but how to try to think about it and to think about this ecological validity thing. So so here's the kind of thing that we were concerned with, the inferences are that you draw from the behavior in that setting. Right. So the issue of ecological validity for us came up strongly when I turn up in Liberia, carrying with me all of the apparatus, all the ways I know to look at cognitive anything. And I realized that they're completely like this. My education didn't prepare me for this, but then to start to work about what is all of this kind of stuff about. So there, I think Robert has done for me what is the classic doubles association experiment, and it's old, but I think it, in one way, it tells you the questions toward which our concern with ecological validity arose in the 1960s. right? And remember, those of you didn't experience directly, but you just sort of project yourself back, right? So you project yourself back to a year like, I think 1966, Robert wrote his first book on perception and culture. Something came out about that time. Is that right, Robert? I'm sorry that what was going on in the 1960s that got us to worry about ecological validity. Why would you do an experiment of the sort that you did? So just
that was 1976. Yeah.
76. I'm off a decade. So but I'll simply explain the experiment, then we can back up. The basic issue was that from tested performance of, let's say, ability to remember or ability to reason, whatever, just right, that the people who had been to school very often were white but didn't have to be, but that sort of schooling made this very big difference, which was normal development. And these other people are kind of left behind. And you could use the achievements that people here on tests, give it to the people over here and draw the same inferences. And we were just saying, no, right? That's an incorrect inference. And if you want to do that, what you'd like to have is two sorts of tasks that you give to people, and you can do double dissociation. These people do better on this task, and these people do better on this task. And then you can relate the differences to other known facts about the people. So I'm not sure which is better. You want me to try to describe your experiment with drawing wire models and clay models, or do you want to do it yourself, Robert?
It's a very simple study, Mike. I mean, I sometimes call it a demonstration experiment, but I used to find that a lot of the interpretation put on performance of what we would nowadays call weird tasks by children in Africa was completely without reference to clever looking, complicated looking activities that the same children performed in their everyday lives. So it's got a lot to do with what Andrew's paper is about. So I took a task which had really bowled me over when I first seen it as a visitor from Europe to Africa, which was the building of little model cars out of strips of wire. And it's a medium which I'd never seen used in Europe, but it's quite widespread in Africa, and just lots of people have testified to that subsequently. So what we did was we just created an artificial task in much the same way that I think Binet created some of his classic tasks of threading beads and whatever he used in the original intelligence test developed in France. We just said, well, if you wanted to see how good somebody is going to be at this well-known activity of making wire cars, let's have a miniature version of it, because it takes quite a while to build a car, but you can give them elements of it. And some of those elements we deliberately made strictly parallel to geometrical figures which are used in Western tests. So the square with diagonals was one of them, which is a kind of, it's a part of the Bender Gestalt test and so on. And then we just basically, by imagination, tried to create a version of this miniature part of making a car out of wire in pencil and paper. So it was already there in the Bender Gestalt test. The square with diagonals was already an established thing. And then we used our third medium, which was clay modeling. The point about clay modeling being that English and European children do a lot of plasticine modeling in school, and African children do a lot of clay modeling in their home environment when the rain comes. So the idea was basically to have exactly the same formal cognitive content represented in three media: in wire modeling, in drawing with a pencil on paper, and in modeling in clay. And the prediction, of course, was self-evident, that the children who were used to wire modeling would do much better on the wire version of the task, and the children who did a lot of drawing at school and at home would be better at the drawing one, and that the two groups would do equally well on the clay modeling, and that's exactly what we found. So it was not a sort of an earth-shattering finding. It was kind of self-evident, but as Mike says, the elegance of it was to kind of show that you could have quantitatively indexed quality of performance on a very structured task, reproduce this square with diagonals, and get radically different group differences depending on the medium in which the task is presented. If the medium connects to the individual's prior experience, that is a familiar task, or is, as I think Andrew might say, an ecologically valid task. I was thinking a lot about this experiment while reading your paper, and I thought, we didn't live up to some of your ideal things. For instance, these were done in a room, they were not done in the wild. I mean, children don't typically build cars indoors; they sit outside doing them, and the clay modeling, obviously, they do outside. So it wasn't an exactly appropriate context in which to tap into the ecosystem that the African children were coming from. So we made the classic mistake of saying, well, let's do the ordinary thing, which is schooling, right? So we had a situation like a test in a school and a one-on-one adult interviewer with a child. All of those mistakes, I think nowadays, if I was to start again, I would design the study differently. But at the time, what I wanted to do is say, well, don't be so surprised that African children don't do very well on the Bender Gestalt test, or the Coase blocks was another famous one, which was very mystifying to the African children I was working with. Because if you give a group of European children a task which is as far from their ecosystem as block design is from an African home setting, you're going to get equally weak performance. And that's what we showed. These English children who were fine with clay modeling and drawing were totally mystified by the wire modeling, and some of them would just say, I can't do that, right? And they would say, well, give it a try. And they would then produce very weak models, because this was beyond the scope of what their experience prepared them for. Is that enough, Mike?
Well, that's not for me to say. It's for others to say, to ask questions. But I think this issue of familiarity in relationship to ecological validity, I think, is really an important issue. We have this old chapter in 1983, some handbook. There's an LCHC chapter. I forget which handbook it's in. On the sort of our sum of theorizing up to that time in the cross-cultural arenas, and in which we take up this issue of differential familiarity as a part of the problem when you do these comparative studies. So I think, yeah, that's what I would mention here, that a lot of our work was aimed at the research of Arthur Jensen and his paper published in 1969 using tests like free recall memory and others to argue that African-American kids were innately incapable of second-degree higher order learning that was supposed to be involved in a number of the standard tasks. So a lot of the issue for us went sort of in the other direction. Andrew, you might now pick up here on things that would be useful to you and others. We did introduce this idea that's related to stuff that Robert has in his comments, which I want to get on the table. But the question where we did actually, Robert, go out, and when Sylvia was not so much engaged in our actual work directed directly at ecological validity, in which we published We wrote this very long paper, sent it to the psychological review, and got 2 reviews. One was by Yuri Bronfenbrenner, and it said, this is so important, you had to publish it in the next issue. And the other one was by Robert Krauss, who I'd done research with, who was a good friend. And his review was, so it's a hard problem. After you solve it, come back and tell us about it. And the editor was William Estes, who was my thesis advisor, and he turned it down. So that paper was on ecological validity that goes through a lot of the early research, focused on ecological validity, qua-ecological validity, never got published to this day, which is interesting. So, but the idea there was could you find the same task in a different setting? What would it mean for a psychologist to claim that what you were doing in the test here was the same as what you had there? Suppose you were testing for ability to type rapidly, right? You would really want to know whether or not, when you were doing that kind of thing, what sort of support there was around the typing. You would want to know, was it the same task? And of course, our research then would take a closed task and put it into different settings, and then watch how the settings tear it apart to figure out how the 2 different kinds of ways of doing things are, interacting with each other. And of course, you're trying to hold together your way. But what Andrew is calling the context has its own tug. So that's where the power and a lot of issues come in. Maybe Andrew, you maybe respond to this, and then I think Robert might summarize the way in which he put it, which may be also very helpful.
Yeah. Let me add one piece, and I have to acknowledge that this part of the paper was just woefully underdeveloped, and but nonetheless, there's Robert and Mike, you 2 are pointing out the decades of work that's been going on. I mean, in a relatively small circle on ecological validity, and how important it is, for those who've maybe seen and appreciated and valued sort of the methodological and the sort of theoretical problems that shortcomings in ecological validity create. Me, as a relative newcomer to this line of work, I mean, I've just been kind of flabbergasted that how old these insights are and how little uptake they have in psychology and in the science of learning and development. I mean, that's like, astounding to me. So I think even if we were to leave it at that, there's just continues to be so much work in the theoretical and empirical work that can, I think, take ecological validity more seriously. But the part of the paper that was really underdeveloped, and this, Mike, may have been why some of the examples were sort of surprising to you, is we were also trying to push the concept of ecological validity itself further into a consideration of, well, what happens when we think about ecologies as the product of new affordances of new and sort of collaboratively created contexts. So, I think that's, at least in my view, that's a different take on ecological validity than the really good and sort of decades long work that has taken place. In other words, it takes, whether it's a learning kind of program context like these exploratorium STEM kinds of things, or even a research context, and says, like schooling, okay, this context has been designed to create new possibilities and allow those new possibilities to sort of emerge through the ecological affordances that are a part of these contexts that have been designed.
Mm-hmm.
So what does ecological validity mean in that context, right? Or if, it could be that we just circumscribe the concept of ecological validity, to the sort of everyday context that already exists. But what about these sort of designed, like Fifth Dimension or like others? What does ecological validity mean then?
Transfer. Yeah. So something like transfer. So let me just give you some examples because, you know, with respect to the fifth dimension, which is, it was so clear from what you showed that an idioculture had developed there, one with a special vocabulary, one with a special ambiance, one with a special, very quiet way that the kids, the very relaxed way and the very deliberately relaxed and slow way in which a lot of the stuff happened. I'm not saying that there wasn't fast stuff, but a lot of it was slow down and breathe, right? And which is cool. All right. But what you're looking for is that as a result of that experience, that features of it, and you name the features like, I thought it was so interesting, the two different points of view, the person who said, oh, the program helps them to deal with failure, right? I think that's that's like the flip side of what it is that the woman who was speaking, or I don't know, the person who was speaking said, that they were looking at it that way. It's that their whole orientation to what they're doing is different, so that a failure is an opportunity to learn about the conditions of possibility for this, and so it's creating a at least in that context, a particular disposition. If I could use, I'm not trained to do this kind of language. I'm making it up as I'm speaking here, right? So use a term like something like that. So it shows up, for example, in our fifth dimension work, you'd get things like teachers coming to Chris Gutierrez at UCLA. And the teachers would start to come after school because the kids who had been in their version of the Las Redes, their version of the fifth dimension, were behaving differently in their classes, and they weren't afraid of the technology, and they were helpful to the other kids in a way that wasn't disruptive to the teacher. And she couldn't explain where it came from, except that it started after the kid got involved in this thing there. So that's like, from time to time you see, and I know that Macy is looking for this very much, the way in which the dispositions that are developed as you walk through the land with people, and people may be gardening there, or you bump into a grandfather there, and you're relating that to the kind of arithmetic in your head back there. There's schooling, there's arithmetic, a thing called, you're not trying to keep them off in their ghetto learning their cute little things that they know, but you want them to be able to learn it somehow on their terms. You'd like, when indeed, like hundreds of years of colonialism are sitting on everything, but that same thing is in our schools. So the exploratoriums is a deviation from a classroom. So the ecologically valid place for the exploratorium activities, the play activities of Sharin's, and the collaborative play activities, it's ecologically natural. Place to which you want to generalize is not to how much they do more dishes at home. You really wanted to see how it generalizes over there. And so I think you should sort of think about it that way. And but can I ask a question? Why didn't you give the example of one of the Lopi examples? See, I had a different idea. To me, in a way, you weren't, it was just like you were pulling up, this example pulls up what I would call universal potentials of children to learn, right? It's engagement, and obviously I've been in those situations too. So you've created this nice environment there. But with Lopi, that's not the kind of thing. With Lopi, what you see is kids who are very good at observing what other people are doing in anticipation that they themselves will be doing that next, right? Because the work is shared around. And so I thought, when you say strength-based, and you would relate it to, say, a cultural or ethnic group, or social, however your group was defined or thought of as different, that what you'd want to do is to build on strengths that you saw there. For example, something like learning to read or learning mathematics, differently organized. So I thought that was what you were going to do. That's why I was very surprised. I had just intuited that your work with And then the Macy, I think, is also connected in with the Lopi people, right? Learning by observing and pitching in. Yep. That's Barbara Rogoff's sort of group's big concept. And that I understand is a kind of strength. And I keep asking, well, is there a reading-based Lopi program? I don't know. I don't actually know the answer to that. But that was what my intuition coming into this with. So it's a violation of my expectation, which may not be shared at all by the others. Others now. Robert, because I still think your comments are valid, and everybody, Auntie, Macy, Armanda, Renee, Jillian. I'm silent now.
Andrew, I would like to hear you just comment on the word validity. And Mike, I get it, but I guess from the videos you were showing, just sort of what's the breadth or the concept of validity? What's it applying to? And Mike, I recognize, and I know we all are haunted by, does it have legs? Where's it going? So how would you describe what you got there? And if we were to look for what has legs, what are the legs? What's the thing that could move?
Oh, Mike, you're muted.
Thank you. Were you asking me or were you asking Andrew, Jill?
I was asking Andrew.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, in fairness, and my apology, I mean, the nature of these videos might have been a little bit of a distraction. They may have skipped a few steps. I mean, Mike, it might have been a better, better to kind of start with some descriptions of Lopi and talk about that as sort of a no.
Well, Andrew, I'm not at all being critical. You understand?
No, it's
right.
Yeah.
So it's not that. It's that we have a polysemic word here.
Yeah.
And we have a word that is not a part of the usual discourse. And it leads in a different direction for me. Robert, I'm just keep speaking for Robert because I can't get him to do this, but I think one of the comments that he has in there, and I think we should discuss it, is the relationship between what you're trying to do in something that you and also Macy refer to as something like a sociocultural political project, where you're taking what is referred to as an activist stance in trying to embody, and you're trying to embody an alternative. And I think what you want to say is, what does ecological validity mean? What is it that is my what does it represent? What is it for? Is it supposed to be a measure of innate intelligence, so that you should treat people differently because some people just are never going to get it? Is it your term context? And I've wrestled this for a long time. Context is just not the text. It's the thing that goes with the text. It's the width that makes the text and the context make meaning, but they're incomplete without the other, right? So I keep going toward like people engaged in particular kinds of activities that can be described in the terms of the cultural practices that sort of assemble them, or that are elements that are being assembled and as a part of a group activity. And it's so I have no trouble at all with what it is that Shirin was doing. I understand entirely what it's about, but I don't think that and the way, so we agreed that we're not using it for the same purposes, right? You're using it in what way are you using it when you apply it to Shirin's the Exploratorium program? When you use it, what does be ecologically valid mean? And what are the two questions? What is ecologically valid, and what are the strengths that it's based on?
Yeah. I'd say overall, what I'm interested to find out and sort of explore is can we connect these different ways that ecological validity is being used, right? So uh, when I use ecological validity in the context of, Shireen's, program here, what it makes me think of is there a place for talking about ecological validity in terms of existing cultural strengths that are often rooted in children's everyday lives, often outside of schools, particularly for children of marginalized or disadvantaged backgrounds. Um, is there a way of using the concept of ecological validity that can get traction on this notion of where they're going, how they're starting from a place of cultural strengths and leveraging contextual affordances to get to somewhere new, right? And it's that somewhere new that maybe the concept of ecological validity. In other words, the what you're seeing in that after school program is valid to a future possibility, not just valid to not that there's anything wrong with this part, yeah, not just valid to a set of strengths that children and youth already have, right?
Well, it seems to me that that's just out of that kind of use. I think you really want to connect with the stuff on utopian methodology, because that's what I think what you're doing reads to me as very similar to that. So you should be in touch with Auntie, who's currently really deeply into that and is engaged in it. But yeah. So I think it's different, and that it would be very helpful then to take up the other point, which is if you're going to take an activist stance, where's the criticism come from? How do you know what you're doing? I mean, by what are your criteria that you're doing anything other than pushing your own values? If you were, why wouldn't it be just equally fine for a Sharia school to open and do the same thing? And just it's a set of values, and it carries with it lots of consequences for the shape of learning and everything else. And it's ecologically valid up against an idealized version of life in a society organized by Sharia law, which I'm sure everybody feels morally committed to and virtuous in if you're inside of that system. So here again, it's like, what do you want to generalize to? I'm for so I guess I don't think you're using it in the same way, and I think it would be helpful for you to differentiate that, because otherwise we'll do things like say, well, there's this old stuff in a completely different discourse where people no longer read to even understand that the problem was discussed up and down and backwards 40 times over during a 20-year period, but in a different dialect slightly, up against different imagined subjects in a different world that was also being misrepresented, but we were trying. Right. Something like that.
Yeah.
Auntie, can I get you to talk? Macy, somebody?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Macy, go ahead.
Yeah, and I'll just be very brief, but I think my hidden heart is kind of active right now with all these questions. I think just because I come from more of like the participatory kind of design-based research, background and less developmental psychology background, and I see affordances, of both, and I think where maybe I'm sort of trying to connect the two because I'm excited by thinking about ecological validity as sort of a dream space, and that kind of excites me. And I think at the same time, the word, and maybe this is Jill, your question, it feels like validity kind of flirts with a kind of neutrality. that doesn't kind of get at more of the activists or the kinds of politics and ethics that we know that are needed to be both made visible and to kind of further in light of histories of colonialism and histories of deficit framing of non-dominant children, and I think it feels like there's this stance towards justice and equity and kind of a different future, um, and so one, I just wanted to say I really appreciated reading the paper, and I was really struck by that last line, and I feel like where we're talking right now, I think you write to what ecology should strength-based development research or interventions be valid when the interventions aim is the creation of new social ecologies, and I really enjoyed that question and thinking about that question, and how is it the co-creation of what is valid, be a space to be that kind of dreaming space? Might it be kind of accounting for future possibilities, or is it allowing designs to be interrupted by the actors of the setting, right? Like what in what ways might we see, or how might ecological validity sort of interface with sort of the work on social dreaming, and how might that move across context or across time, maybe, and maybe time could be a variable that is then thought about, or shifts in, and scales of time or something. But I'm just playing with ideas now, but just appreciate those thoughts, and I can see where it's almost like in the intersection of these lab-based settings and a future design, and like where we try, like how are we bridging, or how are we kind of translating or thinking across those two sort of forms and histories of research.
Okay. Here's where maybe we could use a whiteboard, but I don't know how to use one. So I'm going to just sort of make it up. Like, yeah, we have to put time in the unit of analysis. All of these things are processes that are taking place over time, right? But now if I hear you guys, it's like, well, it's as if I'm going to make it so it looks right for you. It's like we have, this is now in a kind of arc of time, right? Infinite past and infinite future as we look in either direction, if it's culturally mediated, right? So it's like that Tennyson idea of the world as we move through an arch. The world moves as we move through the arch. The future recedes and recedes as we move through. So we're in that kind of temporal thing. Now, what you're saying, I think maybe Macy, for sure, I think Macy's saying that, well, there's an ecological validity, which is this, what we're seeing here is representative of and is of the same sort as this thing going on over here in everyday life now, right? And so if what you're trying to do is to say what you see here is the same kind of thing as you see here, that's one question. Now you guys are saying, okay, I think for your action-oriented and equity-oriented work, a lot of what I've been talking about for all of that early part of my life when I was working on these issues and Robert was working on these issues, it was in this space here, right? We were in this space trying to say, wait, when you give this IQ test to these kids who they come from a non-literate background, no writing in their history, they've been out, and what do you think you're doing, right? And then you try to go out and you try to show, as Robert has done a lot, what the local people value as intelligent behavior in their children. How does that relate to this new institution of schooling? And you guys are saying, okay, that's all fine. That's the past. We want to change the trajectory of the past, right? The past is headed this direction. We don't want it to go that way. We want to change it. And we have this idea of a ecologically valid in the sense is it satisfies our values and it's a livable, decent environment. It's a place for people to be. It's a future that you want. It's valid with respect to that, right? And then as your time goes forward, you presumably get closer and closer to that in your dreams, right? In your attempts at forward movement. It's when you move from this side over toward this side that I think you need a strong way to test yourself, because you can be dead wrong.
Yeah.
You can be dead wrong. And what bothers me about the activist stuff on this is that just showing over and over again that if you get a lot of energy together and a lot of superstructure and you create an environment that brings out what Andrew I would call kids' inherent potential for learning in pro-social and supportive environments. That's the draw that you're trying to get with all it, because and the other stuff it does a lot of that. The fifth dimension does a version of the same thing of trying to mix motives. So everything's mixed motives, mixed leading activities. Everybody's got something to do.
Yeah.
There's more to do than you can get done. And then it creates that kind of effervescence of a sort where you see with the children excitedly learning about stuff. But you then still have to respond. And that's Macy's working on her thesis design. If you go for a walk in the forest with the teachers, or you bring the teachers and the parents together to take a walk in the forest to the land where grandpa was buried or something like that, does it turn up later in the teacher's practices in school? If it doesn't mean that it wasn't a good learning experience for everybody involved and have some sort of influence over here where, it could have influences over there, but it doesn't help you deal with the fact that these other people have the access to the technology. They control this, they control that. We want to control our own land. It doesn't respond, to that. So it's a dilemma. I mean, that's it. That's life.
Mike, can I add a piece in? And I know you've got, but just to respond to Mike's, and I'm gonna get the wrong mirror kind of thing, but I think I'll be able to, just describe. So, so you characterize the work that you and Robert and many others have been doing to try to resolve this problematic correspondence between research activities and what people are doing and what they're capable of in their everyday lives in sort of this way, right? And so to me, the kind of future orientation or the activist piece or whatever it is also relevant to this question, because so let's take the instance of Lopi, right? Communities organized with this sort of learning and learning by observing and pitching in pattern are also under constant transformation that's driven by aspiration and sort of ideology and things like that, right? So when I think about ecological validity, one concern of mine is to make that concept relevant not only to what's currently existing in those communities, but also where things are going in the future, right? What people's aspirations are and how those aspirations will guide sort of contextual transformations, and things like that. In a way that maybe is almost separate to a program that's designed as a specific kind of intervention and a specific kind of activist sort of orientation. In other words, how do we account for in the concept of ecological validity sort of the past and the future of culture, right, over here? And I don't have a good answer to that right now. So, Auntie, I'm sorry to have jumped in there, but go ahead. Yeah.
I'm not in a hurry. Again, I apologize for the background noise. Well, I was this strength-based education and Louis Moll's funds of knowledge. And now you have this take with the ecological validity. I remember an interesting paper some years ago on the Funds of Knowledge project. It was kind of criticized in a sense. So when you have this kind of designed experiments in which build on like families and children's strengths, but on the other hand, it can be construed a little bit as romantic in the sense because those demands of the researchers who measure children's skills, they are pretty much part of the ecologically valid environment of the children. I mean, in that paper, they used the notion of cultural capital versus funds of knowledge. So it's a very real political force on the children that that they might have strengths that are valued locally, but they might not be valued in relation to other future relevant contexts of their lives, such as like getting a job or getting you know, a place at the university. So that then you need to develop competencies that are like, you know, valued outside of the community. And as in your paper, you kind of brought the political into the question. I'm thinking out loud. I would be interested in hearing your like reflections on kind of these sorts of concerns in relation to your points about ecologically valid. How would you kind of take into account these like broader power relations in the society in relation to knowing and learning and development, and how could those be studied? And when we do design-based research, can we somehow take that into account, or is it like that we are actually doing even harm to the children if we are detracting their time from, you know, getting those competencies that they need to be successful in the school? I'm not advocating for that either, but I think it's a genuine contradiction.
Auntie, did you want me to respond to that first? I think so, maybe. Yeah.
Maybe you can. We can have this person if there.
Yeah. So I've seen some of those critiques of funds of knowledge, and in one chapter I remember, you know, it's called sort of a loving critique, which I think was nice and generous and accurate. You know, in this idea that, and even Louis Moll and others in the sort of push from funds of knowledge into funds of identity have kind of, he's himself sort of acknowledged this critique, is that funds of knowledge maybe only become strengths. And we tried to quote some of this in the chapter. Funds of knowledge maybe only become cultural strengths as they're put to use in new contexts. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that relates to what we were arguing about actor perspectives and about needing to understand. So in other words, funds of knowledge, cultural strengths shouldn't be, I think, just considered an inventory of things that people can do in a relatively static way. You know, things on a shelf, right? Where funds of knowledge become strengths is when those things are applied as, you know, as tools for getting things done, or as tools for becoming in sort of that sort of identity kind of way. Of course, all those possibilities are always constrained by politics. They're always constrained by access to resources and and things like that. So I think the question of politics is absolutely central. You know, it's not just pulling something off the shelf and putting it to use. It's putting it to use in ways that maybe push against some of those barriers, or maybe are put to use in a limited way because of those barriers. So maybe I'm not feeling satisfied with that answer. Maybe you are, but I don't know. Maybe folks who are more involved in sort of design-based research, or anybody can weigh in here too.
So before I duck out, I'd just like to kind of comment on how this conversation has flowed relative to what I sent as a written comment. I think is largely out of date now. I think I've learnt a lot about what Andrew is trying to achieve with that paper by listening to this conversation. I'm somewhat unfriendly to definitions as in general. I don't think they're usually very helpful, but I was trying to pick a hole in the definition and say, well, you're asking for too much to qualify for valid. I don't think you're ever going to have something which meets your definition of what's ecologically valid. And I sort of harked back to a lovely paper by Sylvia Scribner back in the day where she said, look, experiments do not lose their relevance just because of the fact that they come from Western science. They've got an application within an ecologically valid framework. And of course, she and Mike did some beautiful ecologically situated experiments in their time. But I think what I felt perhaps as a paper you were trying to do, which might not be helpful to your overall objectives, was to cover with the word validity both the representativeness issue and the ethical and political issues. And I think for me, those are both important issues, but they're not the same. And to try to say it's not valid unless it's got that political dimension built into it, it runs a number of risks. I mean, the people who have at least bought the notion that ecological validity is a relevant criterion for descriptively adequate research may get put off, as Mike put it, that say, well, this guy just wants to bring his personal political agenda to bear on this, and you don't need to do that. I think one way of linking the two themes, the representational validity to the future-oriented, aspirational, political dimension, is to say, well, why should we care about representational validity? And that's something which has dawned on me, I think, much more later on in my work. I think when I first got preoccupied with it, I was just saying, well, these like the Jensen work that Mike was citing, it's not just mischievous, it's also totally naively misleading. And so I wanted to kind of knock it down on its own territory, just say these people think they're very sophisticated, but actually the tests they're using are absurd. But I think what I now feel is that the whole agenda of demystifying modern Western science was actually a political agenda, and so I think what I now find myself saying to my African colleagues is, don't be put off by the fact that many of the examples that are missing from the design of Western tests seem somehow old-fashioned, because that's not the reason why you're pointing to them. In fact, many of the subtests of the Western tests are also old-fashioned, but old-fashioned in European terms. So that's not the point. The point is that if you're bringing a child from one context into another, and that's of course the universal global agenda of everybody is entitled to and should go to school, you need to realize that schools are defined currently by a lot of history, which is quite arbitrary in its connection to the content. So sitting at rows of desks in rectangular buildings is a completely irrelevant design feature of schools if you take their serious objectives seriously. And so I get kind of upset with African politicians who say what we need is more schools, we need better roofs on our schools, because actually, under a tree, the most important things that they want to do with education could happen just as well as under a roof. So I think the definition of what is now known as weird culture as intrinsic to intelligence, as I thought Jensen was mistakenly saying, is just one version of a political issue, which is of Western cultural hegemony, that it's also definitive of what's going on in schools. A great deal of curriculum, not just the buildings and the materials, but even the curriculum, is aimed at cultivating an individualistic conception, which you attack very nicely in your paper. I think that the idea that cognition is a property of an individual mind rather than something which is enmeshed in its cultural context. So there are lots of ways, I think, of justifying critique of Western tests. And the thing is to kind of protect this more exciting, in many ways, political agenda, and not to sort of mask it under this is just one aspect of validity. I don't think it is really well named as validity. I think it's better to leave validity alone and put those commitments into real political aspects of what's going on, not only in the United States, but all over the world, that people are contesting the relevance of what has become the dominant discourse of this is education. Education equals schooling. Well, even if you're willing to buy that, which I'm not, and you have to say, but what do we mean by schooling? What kind of schooling? So the whole informative potential of cultural psychology goes beyond critiquing measurement of cognitive functions into defining agendas for education, trying to represent that aspirational side of culture and not just the knowledge. So that's, I think I should shut up there.
No, thanks. That's very helpful. Yeah.
It seems like it feels like like you
said, everybody froze. Maybe I have.
Well, I was going to say, Robert, I thought you did a good job of summarizing what we agree on, right? That that the use of the term ecological validity is not the center of what Andrew's concerns are about here, right? And to bring it in is a little bit of maybe even something of a distraction. And I do think that when you go in this direction, you do have to find criteria for self-criticism, no matter what. And so I think when you go that direction, it's one thing to just be active and get into it and know it and say whatever you like, but it's another thing as a scholar to do it in a self-critical way. And we don't have sort of to build up institutions of criticism on those grounds and not on, is this a 0.05 level effect of some experimental treatment, which used to be the criterion when I grew up. Do we have any, maybe we're losing people here. So I'm thinking maybe that's just about it. Jill?
Andrew, I'd like to tell you what's been going through my mind to answer my own question to you. I wasn't sure what I was asking about validity, but as this conversation has continued, I think the word I would substitute for the moment to validity is just connection making. And when I watched those little videos, I think it was particularly in the second one, where one of the narrators says facilitation and watching facilitation in the environment. And that just turned on all the lights for me. I'm a teacher of teachers, and I'm always thinking about what are teachers doing. And I think in the teaching learning dynamic, in the kinds of environments you portrayed in the tinkering place, and Macy, what I sense, I'm just picking up a sense. It's like, what kind of connections are people making? And those are the legs on which I think transfer ultimately happens. But I would love to just, if I were on a research team, looking at those kind of videos with you or listening in closely, I would be curious, what kind of connections are children making? When you walk into that environment, it just looks like walking into someone's woodworking shop or an engineer shop, and it's like, "Ooh, I want to try that. I want to try out that. Oh, that looks interesting. What happened there?" It's just like things start happening, and oh, I never saw that before. I wonder what it does. Or, oh, I saw someone use that. I want to try it this way. So you just watch and listen for how do people make connections in that setting. And then whether you look at it in another setting and sort of like what connections get fired up. So I'd want to just, Mike has a much more articulate way of saying, I feel like what I'm suggesting is starting just at the very minute ground level. And then ultimately, when we look at schooling in cultures, whatever that mess is that we're all trying to wrestle with, we got to figure out how to look at what kind of connections, in a sense, are generative to the kinds of problems, because you had that way of saying connections that help us get things done in the world, as opposed to this static, I got a bunch of cultural knowledge here and I may or may not have it over here, but we got to get stuff done. And it seems to me we got to build up these networks of connection making sort of from two directions. So that's the word I'm thinking of.
Yeah, thanks.
Auntie, you have your hand up.
I was thinking what Robert said about education and schooling and their difference. I wonder if it would be a good example to think about this. If we think about the work done by our Norwegian colleague Ola Erstad, they had this learning lives perspective in which I think they made the argument that in order to understand children's learning, we should not take the school as the starting point, as the unit of analysis, but rather take the individual as a unit of analysis and follow them as much as possible throughout the day to their varied contexts. So I wonder whether then, like a question about the makerspace, for example, whether, that kind of design or research is ecologically valid. I mean, that might be just one place for the child's education, and there are different boundaries in our lives, and there are also contrasts. I mean, that Erstad's work has shown that these different contexts are, and their interrelationships are relevant in understanding what we do in one context. So at the face value, it would make sense. I mean, in your paper, you address the units of analysis. It would seem like an ecologically valid move to expand the unit of analysis to involve more than one context of these like research participants' lives. And they might have like different competencies and different kind of strengths in relation to their different contexts, and also what they do in one context could influence greatly their other contexts. I remember one paper which was studied like bakers, and it was a case study of two baker students. One of them had chosen the baking because it allowed him to stay with his family, because he was working at nights and then he was spending time with the family, and the other baker student was a single woman and wanted to have her own enterprise. So these kind of other contexts in their lives significantly like influenced the kind of motivation they had for their studies. So yeah, maybe it's more a comment than a question, but I was like inspired what Robert said about education and schooling, and maybe also have a little bit like more heterogeneous understand of the strength and the community, because we are like have heterogeneous identities in the plural society of these days.
So this is probably one of the things that's best about these coffee hours is that you end up just like with your head spinning at the end, which is great. So my head's a little my head's a little spinning now. But one thing I'm thinking of, okay, so I grew up in middle class European American communities where even at the time that I was growing up, there was just an absolute thorough penetration of just neoliberal values and principles around how adults and kids work with each other, right? So a lot of my research has been on chores and kids' involvement in household work. And I mean, at least in my family, but I know it's not just my family, every aspect of that was quid pro quo. If you do this, then you get that. And this sort of exchange principle for how adults and kids relate to one another. So, if me as a young kid, if I had been put into some after school program, or if I had even been put in some kind of a research context with values and practices that were very different than that, right? Then that would not have been ecologically valid for me, But nonetheless, I mean, I mean, I find now in my adulthood, I'm quite critical of that sort of penetration of neoliberal sort of aspects of family relations and things like that. So in my sort of head spinning state right now, I'm just wondering, like, and Mike, this gets to your point about sort of needing to be critical and self-critical and needing to have sort of a piece. At least I'm thinking about that too. Is like, is it the end all be all for something to be ecologically valid, right? Or in what ways should things be ecologically valid or not? I mean, yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I would, if school, or which it was the case in school for me, or if in the other kinds of contexts that I was involved with outside of my family, if all of those were ecologically valid to the kind of exchange principles that were common in my family, I mean, maybe that wouldn't have done me any favors. I don't know.
I just think you want to just relax for a while and rethink what the use of the term, and look, if you look back at the way and the problems at which people were trying to draw inferences from small samples of behavior to a population.
Yeah.
Right. You're not in that sense trying to do that. You're trying to create new forms of life, new forms of activity, in order to release potentials that you theoretically you believe deeply, both personally and professionally, that these kids have a lot of potential to learn and master the kinds of skills that modern society is going to require of them if they want to lead a middle-class life.
Right.
Right. Fine. So, I mean, that's why I say you check with Antti, look at the way in which, with the fifth dimension, what we've done is to create a small way of life. We've looked at a social ecology. We've tried to take this new ecological thing, place it in that ecology, and see whether or not it can maintain its life. Is it pulled apart right away, or does it start to organize the life around it? How do these things interact over time? It's really, I don't have to worry in that sense about ecologically valid or not. I'm not trying to draw those kinds of conclusions.
Yeah.
Just a little, anyway, that's about as far as I think we can go. This will be posted. People come back and take a look at it if they like. Andrew, we all learned a lot, and it's the paper. We dug into it, but I think that the paper is just fine. People enjoyed it, and I hope this was useful for you.
No, I really appreciate everybody's comments, and especially critical comments. You sort of write a paper and then,
Nothing
2 days
happens, right?
later, well, right, and then 2 days later, you keep thinking about the ideas, and the shelf life of things becomes quite short.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's the whole game. So I just appreciate the conversation,
Sure.
and thanks for taking the time, everybody.
So did we. Thanks for everybody for coming, and we'll see you again next time. Something like that.
Okay.